I'm Mark Statman, and we haven't really quite worked this out. So what I thought the way we could do this was, I'll give a short little thing. I think we talked about this before. I'm going to give a short opening sort of context for what we're doing here, and then Nance, would you be willing to go
Sure.
next?
Yes.
And then Todd, and then Lisa, and then Joseph. Can you still hear? Are you still here? Can you close with the poem that you sent me? Okay. I like this. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to just read from some notes, and just so that everyone knows, two of the five of us recently. Hi, Catherine. Recently had our second COVID vaccines, and we're still a little weak. So if you notice that some of us seem not to be in focus, that's one of the reasons why. So so this roundtable was conceived when we sort of talked about it, which was over a year ago, year and a half ago. We conceived of it in a very different way because the world looked different. Donald Trump was still in power, which was horrible. There was this rising acceptance of authoritarianism in the world. I think of Europe, the movements in Turkey and France and Germany and in the UK. I think of Latin America, Brazil, Nicaragua. These are just off the top of my head. The Asian continents, India, China, Philippines. There was all the environmental issues that have been plaguing the world for decades and decades and decades, underlying questions of international human rights. But when we started thinking about this panel, there was no COVID. There had been no George Floyd, although obviously there had been lots of brutality in the world. There had been none of the pushback or the marches that we saw throughout the United States. There was no Joe Biden about to become elected. There was no January 6th. And I didn't even live in the United States anymore. I had already stopped viewing the world through the United States lens and through my old ideas of what mattered. If you had asked me last year, around the time that we thought of doing this panel, what the biggest problems facing the world, that is my world, were, I'd have said water, because that's what it is where I live now, which is, for those of you who don't know, which is southern Mexico. I'd have said a lack of access to technology, because 65% of the people where I live have no cell phones, which means that they couldn't even participate in this. They couldn't be here right now with us, Zooming, and they still can't. Schools are closed. I mean, some of them are opening now because of vaccines and stuff like that. But I'd have said a lack of basic health care, meaning not just health insurance, but no doctors, no nurses, no aides, no hospitals, no clinics, because they just don't exist. And COVID is one of just many problems of disease in this part of the world. I'd have talked about the fact that the informal economy here is 80%, right? Because that's just what it is. Most people don't have jobs that you would recognize as formal jobs, and there's no tax base because of that. I'd have said education, because most people find that there's no value, not even in finishing high school, but in starting high school. You'd find that over 50% of the young mothers here are under the age of 16. I'd have talked about environmental degradation on the part of the people in government and foreign corporations, but not in the same way that we necessarily talk about it in the United States, because the oil industry is actually a source of national pride here. The day that Mexico nationalized its oil industry is actually practically a national holiday. It's celebrated every single year. And so when people talk about moving away from a carbon-based economy, they're actually talking about moving away from something which has been an amazing thing for them for for decades and decades. And to move away from that economy could be a disaster. We know that it doesn't have to be, but it could be. And I'd also said that that in a certain way, there's no difference in facing those issues than there was in facing a lot of the issues where I still living in the United States, where I'd lived for 58 years of my life. So what I'm getting at is, for me, and this is kind of, for me, the part of the context of what we're going to talk about today, but each person is going to talk about it a little differently, is that in being an expatriate, I had a growing sense last year that expatriation, right, is not just a physical thing, that it's also, it's not just simply about not living in one's own country, which is what it is, with no intention of ever living there again, which is the plan. But it's not just a physical or spatial process, but it's also one of culture, of society, of politics, economics, aesthetics, and spirit. And I'm linking those words specifically because politics, society, aesthetics, economy, spirit, with culture, as a poet, to me, they seem connected, but I also have had the privilege of seeing them as disconnected. And I've also had the privilege of thinking that tension is a very powerful one and can be a successful one for me. In my life in the US, I had the freedom to disconnect. I could call on politics, economy, on society, on aesthetics, on spirit, and see them as separate if I felt like that. But one of the things that part of my expatriation has been discovering that here in Southern Mexico, they're not disconnected. In fact, they're very, very connected, that people actually don't make those distinctions. When people talk about culture, they are talking about all those things and how they're linked. If you go into a market, a market is a museum, right? It's also an economic space. If you walk along the street, it's a concert hall. If anybody who spent any time in this part of the world knows that these things are interwoven, and there is actually no sort of like, the person who is, who drives your taxi might also be the very same musician that you see on the street, and his partner or her partner may very well be, a painter whose work you were admiring and whose poetry you were reading on the side of a library. So there isn't this sort of like, well, I'm a poet and you're an engineer and you're this. It's sort of like life is full of connections. So part of my expatriation has been about feeling continuously disconnected from the United States, right? And from what all the assumptions I used to have about the United States. So one of the things that I've spent the last 4.5 years doing, Catherine, who's over there on the Hollywood squares, we moved down here in September of 2016, which was, we didn't know that Donald Trump was going to be elected. We just thought we were leaving for a lot of reasons, but a lot of those reasons that we wanted to leave happened to be the very reasons that Donald Trump won. And so for me, the question of what is it that poetry can do, ought to do, or better, what was it that I ought to do as a poet? And that's become a huge project for me, because when I lived in the United States, I felt like I already had those answers. I felt like they were givens. I was a poet, I wrote poetry, I engaged, I disengaged. When I felt, I taught, I didn't teach, whatever it seemed I needed to do, I could do. But it seems to me that it's become a much deeper question for me. And the reason I wanted this roundtable was because I wanted to ask some people who I thought could sort of help me think about this problem. And I don't view problem as oh God, but as is this an interesting thing to have to work through? So, Nance, Todd, Lisa, Joseph, and everybody here, I wanted us to think about it. And I've said nothing so far about the two big themes that I know others are going to talk about, corruption and hope, because I want to leave that to the others. I wanted to talk about expatriation, because I think that it's something that we can physically have, but I think it's more. And I think that one of the things that the last 4.5 years, whenever I visited the United States, I felt an expatriation among people who have not expatriated themselves, but who have wandered through this. So I feel kind of caught between worlds of freedom, of privilege, of choice. But I also feel not. When Trump was elected, I remember turning to our son. He's a musician, a singer-songwriter, and he was 22 at the time, I think, and saying, nothing's changed. Like we thought, well, how could Trump get elected? Nothing's changed. The work just got a little harder. And when he asked me what that work was, my reply was, because it was the only thing I could think of, was putting beauty in the world, right? So I want to close my little part with a poem that a recent poem called from a new manuscript called and this is called Against Darkness. The trappings against darkness, the trappings of light, design of the world, question of when falsehood a lie and when truth, we place a coin in the mouths of the dead. I place a coin in the hand of the woman on the street who sits there, a half-eaten tamale next to her. She looks to be 80, she could be 60. What way to ask? There's no way. She will not be on the line for vaccines. The world's divisions aren't usually subtle. They play out stupidly for all to see. I don't go looking for God in too many places. Adivino, I guess. God is everywhere, but that woman is every day in the same place, herself, all in disarray, thin, a small voice. The proposition is that the sentence must say something. I don't know her sentence. The horizon glimmers with the start and end of day, facing east, hope, west, night. I wonder what space to claim, what seat, the air full of sighs, the echo of sighs, telltale song of uncertain love, uncertain lovers. They wait for morning. We all wait, false desires, darkness, these illusions, uneasy truths. Nance, you're up.
Thank you, and thanks for the poem, Mark, and the intro. I want to thank Mark for putting this together and inviting me to join my brilliant friends and poets on this panel. I'm going to talk about inaugural poems, and but in particular, Amanda Gorman's poem. There was a Facebook firestorm in New Orleans. Some of those people might be here when after the inauguration, and I was getting over COVID and actually going through the monoclonal infusion, the same one that Trump and Giuliani got. And I'll just, if you get a chance, if you ever do get COVID and you get a chance, do it because you're better immediately. We could have gone dancing. So she talks about, real optimism, but she also, didn't finish her poem until after the attack on the Capitol. There were only 6 inaugural poems under 4 presidents. I don't know why I didn't know that. I don't know why I thought it was more of a tradition than that. The first was Robert Frost at JFK's inauguration. He was my grandfather's favorite poem, but I don't remember that poem at all. It was 6. But I've since read it, The Gift, outright. It's short, it's jingoistic, it's ignores anyone who stood on this land before white men. It was a land of British colonists, pretty much, period. It says, before we were her people, she was ours, in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials. I didn't enjoy it. And then Maya Angelou was the next poet laureate. I was kind of surprised that Carter didn't have one, but she read On the Pulse of Morning, which is pretty famous, as you know. She goes back to mastodons and dinosaurs, acknowledging the history of this country and this land. and talks about your armed struggles for profit have left collars of waste upon my shore, currents of debris upon my breast. And she also acknowledges the people who populate this country, the Asian, the Hispanic, the Jew, the African, the Native American, the Sioux. And that not everyone came here of their own accord. You, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Kru, bought, sold, stolen, arriving on the nightmare, praying for a dream. She was the first to address slavery. And except for Clinton's second inaugural poet, everyone else did too. Miller Williams was his Arkansas homie, and he was his second inaugural poet, and he was traditional, you know, and he was optimistic, and that change lies in the hands of children, the children. And how does your garden grow? With waving hands strangely in a row, and flowering faces, and brambles that we can no longer allow, whose law was never so much of the hand as the head, cannot let chaos make its way to the heart. And these, Williams and Frost were our last white male poets. I'm thankful for that. And Obama had Elizabeth Alexander, the first African-American inaugural poet for the first African-American president. And she, you know, talks about those who died on a day to make it possible on the brim of on the cusp. And indeed, Obama's presidency did usher in overt racial hatred that this country hasn't seen since in decades. And as you all know, gun sales skyrocketed. I just read in the paper today that there have been, since the verdict was read at George Floyd's trial, that there have been an unbelievable number of mass shootings since then. That, like, I mean, you know, dozens of people, and it's, you know, been not even a week. Elizabeth, Richard Blanco is, excuse me, pardon me, I lost my way. Richard Blanco is the first openly gay Latino poet, and he extols also, like they all do, unity in his poem One Today. And it's sort of Whitman-esque, extolling the natural beauty of this country, and optimistic like them all, and home always under one sky, our sky. And when I was reading it, I couldn't think of Trump's border wall coming with the next president in light of Ricardo Blanco's poem. And so when we got to, I don't have to tell anybody here that Trump didn't have a poet laureate. I don't think he's ever read a poem, but I was really surprised and pleased that there was a 23-year-old African-American poet laureate woman. And then I thought, you know, but I thought, you know, if we're going to have it, why couldn't it be Dillard graduate Jericho Brown, poet laureate, you know? He's not poet laureate, but Pulitzer Prize winner. And then we can have the shout out to DU. And, you know, a dear friend of mine said the same thing. How come we have a poet laureate? How come it's not Joy Harjo? But like I said, I missed the inauguration. School was starting. I was getting over COVID. And which I want to say Bill gave me for my anniversary. So I read it though, right afterward, actually I watched it. And the African-American, the Facebook, you know, I had to quit reading because it was really surprising to me. And all my African-American friends and loved it. And all of them, 100%. And my New Orleans poet friends, white poet friends, were a little less than welcoming about and positive about the poem. And I was startled that it was panned and that it was received like that. I really was, because I thought it was they were saying she spoke the word too rhymey, and I thought that was really the reason, part of the reasons that I liked it. But mostly I thought, why wasn't I that smart, and why didn't I have that kind of style when I was her age? Because I sure thought I did, you know. So I loved the hip hop flow. I loved hearing that at the inauguration. I thought it was fresh. She didn't use any punctuation, not even a period at the end. And I also loved the look on Barack and Michelle's faces when she was reading, because they were startled, they were floored, they were stunned, and I was too. She had difficulty finishing the poem, and she didn't wait till, but after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, she wrote these lines. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. My first assignment in all my classes at Dillard, from freshmen to seniors, was to read this poem and discuss it. And most of my students had done neither before this, but many of them, I urged them to watch her read it as well and not just read it. And they wept like I did, and they also they were a little jelly like I was, that she was so smart and beautiful and poised, and for a 23-year-old in front of a president. And they loved this line: a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president only to find herself reciting for one. She gave them hope. They were proud. They'd cried. They were mad at what she was, some of what she was writing about. They were also, my favorite thing, they wanted to read more poetry, and we did. And that same class is writing on poetry now, and she addressed, racism, sexism, social, cultural despair, hope, and especially today, hope. But she also incited protest, clamor, and disappointment. And I mean, the Facebook page, that they were disappointed. A lot of the poets were disappointed. And one of my friends had to take his post down. But part of it's back up, okay? His response to having to take it down. And so I wanted to read one of his recent posts that fawn over her and who she is and what she has overcome, fine. Praise her focus and performance skill, fine. The poem addressed the moment, okay. But when do we have that conversation about the difference between a poem and a sermon, a poem and an essay, a poetic essay, prose poetry, and poetic prose? There's a difference between a bull and an ox, a pickle and a Tootsie Roll. They all have value, they're just different things. When genres cross to the point of mush, where we can no longer discern one from the other, then all is lost. I thought it was harsh, and I thought he raised some valid questions. And I'd like you to think about that, maybe respond to that later. And I also, in closing, I want to read another poem written at the beginning, about a year ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, by my 12-year-old granddaughter, Roxy Lavender. It's called, I'm having trouble already. This poem really made me whelp up when she wrote it. It's called Quarantine. It started with a month. It started with, it'll be over soon, don't worry. It started with 2 months. It started with, this is taking a little longer than we planned, but it's fine, don't worry. It started with a year, 5 years, 10 years. Don't worry, everything's normal and perfect and fine. Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. And all I think is that maybe years from now, I'll be telling my grandchildren that, yes, I do remember what it was like before, when you could actually see your friends in real life, when schools weren't always on screens, when you could go outside freely and to stores and on planes, when you could travel the world, when you could go to places called restaurants, when you could march for your freedom and for others. But don't worry, really, everything's fine. But the only problem is I do worry. I worry all the time. I'm scared. Scared because I don't know what comes next. I don't want to be this part of history. This is supposed to be the part that you read about in textbooks. This death count isn't supposed to be real. It's supposed to be numbers on a page. We can't do this. This isn't supposed to happen to us, only to irrelevant, long dead names. We aren't supposed to really actually die. I'm scared and I worry. Oh, how I worry. Thank you.
Todd, you want to go?
Sure.
I know it's a rough, hard to follow.
I know. Thanks, Nance. That was awesome. Thank you, Mark, for including me in this great panel. Thanks, Bill and Megan and Jonathan and the whole board for continuing this just amazing poetry festival. It's really, I can't wait to be back in person. And the one time before I got to go, it was just incredible. It was one of the few such professional activities I've ever been at where I felt like all the institutional bullshit was on the side and it was just really actually about community, which feels very hard to find these days. Which makes me think of Mark's opening statement, which very much sort of, plucked a string and made me think I need to move to southern Mexico, where maybe the things are perhaps a little freer from some of the institutional constraints. One of the things I've been thinking, we're all missing so much in the pandemic, but one of the things I started feeling overwhelmingly was maybe all the things that I've been missing are just bullshit to begin with. What value is there in the quote normal world to go back and be a consumer and go to restaurants and consume and buy things? And what are the actual forms of life and social relations available to us in late capitalism? What of this system do I actually miss? So I don't know. So I had all these different things sort of bobbing around in my head, and when I settled, I ended up settling. It all just kind of poured out, I think Thursday, in one fell swoop, and I kind of settled on the side of corruption. How might I hope to corrupt you? Oh, let me count the ways, and essay at poeming. May I corrupt you corporally, sensually? May I corrupt your sense and senses, your eye and ear? May I corrupt your body and margin, your page and line of thought? May I corrupt lyrically your lyric sensibility? May I corrupt you senseless, dissensually, and resigned? May I corrupt you up a semiotic revolution, Julia, rolling in the hay of history with that thematic thesis? May I corrupt you gently, Giarek, with the force of my art, my queer estrangements? May I corrupt you queer you corpse-like? May I release, or is it release you from the other side of the symbolic, of the social, of the American imago? May I corrupt you beyond our current sensibility, beyond any sensible life? Ooh, what a waste. May I corrupt your neoliberal libertarian, neoconservative liberationist, eco-feminist revolutionary, Marxist democratic, socialist phenomenological, post-psychoanalytic deluser-gotarian, spick and span Spivackian, queer theoretical cum, or Butleresque burlesque ideology? Oh shit, I think I just canceled myself. All of which is to say, I don't know how to speak properly to the founding assumption I see in our panel's title and prompt that corruption is contrary to the good, the socio-political common good that perhaps exists or persists as a fantasy and fantasy alone, if fantasy is ever only fantasy, being the reality in which we inevitably live, if we can be said to properly live. How do we live with others, allow others their fantasies, their subjective truths, if they entail the corruption of our own, if they demand we cede our own self-dispossession, if they insist upon our own obliteration? One question that raises then is whether such a fantasy as the common good might be said to be inevitable or not, and if not, whether such a fantasy might be productive or not, and if not, how to divest from it, to traverse it as it were, to corrupt and explode, to raise and reconstruct differently the narrative, with poetry or analysis. Either way, if it is productive, then productive of what? Perhaps the corruptions of capitalism itself have corrupted all possibilities of thinking life outside of the Mobius strip of reproduction. Another question that raises is whether a fantasy entailing a marginalization or obliteration of others is anathema or endemic to such a fantasy as the common good, or both. If endemic, if inevitable, if so, then how to obliterate it itself? Such a fantasy as fantasies of a straight planet, a white nation, a Christian theocracy, an Edenic turn. I don't know. I don't know, as I said before, what to say, my dears, my dear poets and peers, my peeps and my fellow queers, if any of you are out there peeking in these dark pixelations. I have only questions as usual. I'll end by questioning then, what kind of corruption, and corruption of what, do we mean? What is the objet of our corruption? The object? What is the objective and what its means? What might it mean, or is meaning itself the target? Is there life without narrative? Would we poets want to de-narrativize life, or is that just us experimental types? Do you believe in life after love, time after corruption? Which corruption again? A mind ever in Valérie's poetic state of mind is surely lost to an us in an inflamed forest of la langue. Oui ou non? We or none? Is that the question or the answer? And thus spoke the typo. And with this, I transmit your it. Please know I stole Corpse Light from the amazing poet Joseph Weiss, from whom you will hear a bit later. If you don't know his poetry, please read it. He is awesome. So that's it. Thank you.
Wow.
Great.
Lisa?
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Todd, for being really hard to follow. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, it's really interesting that initially we talked about this panel when the orange one was still president. And I originally imagined my contribution to this conversation as a dinner menu. I was going to develop some conceptual dishes. It was going to be my 21st century socialist response to the futurist cookbook, that 1932 food manifesto of inedible recipes assembled by fascist sympathizer Italian artist Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Like so many neo-fascists today, Marinetti was a publicist's wet dream. As an Italian, he announced the enemy was pasta. He challenged fellow artists to fencing duels. He was a good fencer. And he put forward the concept of arrow food. So in pre-pandemic times, I felt this would work as a poetic response to the times, to the idea of corruption and our reaction and language, and how language was not always enough. So it was problematic for me, though, because I actually believe that food, like poetry, is often generally celebratory by its mere existence. And to give you an idea of some of my recipe poem ideas for, the end of 2019, going into the beginning of 2020, this was a dolce, a tweet of delicately broiled endangered Gulf birds garnished with whipped North Korean nuclear warheads, served on a broken down Amazon delivery box, garnished with microplastic. Then, of course, spring 2020 occurred and the festival was canceled, and I stopped finishing poems and I stopped cooking for other people because of the quarantine social restrictions. Maybe this stopping of finishing poems was because poetry is very life affirming, even if it's not optimistic, it's very life affirming for me, and I was not feeling affirmative. Obviously, when you're on now, we do have this huge improvement in your American in Chief. Biden's actively trying to galvanize Americans to tackle climate change and the pandemic. But on the other hand, we have the police fatally shooting 6 people in the US within 24 hours of the Chauvin verdict, including the police murder of Ma'Khia Bryant. And as a foreigner, I feel really ill-equipped to deal with some of these issues of American corruption with you, because we see the issues differently by definition. I don't really understand many American assumptions because the issues are not universal. They simply have universal impact, and that difference is so constant for me. And defining American history, directions, errors, triumphs, as a privileged white foreigner among you, I also have a fairly non-specific accent, it sometimes feels like I'm talking into a mirror that looks a little bit like the funhouse in Orson Welles' Lady of Shanghai. To be honest, since the inauguration of the 46th president, my position as a visa holder alien has become more difficult. And that's actually true for most immigrants, paperless migrants, refugees, and legal visa holders here in America. And we are now wondering whether the new restrictions that came in with the new inauguration relating to the pandemic, when are they going to be lifted? And what does that look like? But, you know, as Nancy read, don't worry, everything is fine. So all of this makes language and poetry so interesting. And poetry as a transgressor of borders is so important when our physicality is challenged and changed and quarantined. But I still can't cook for many other people, and I still can't finish poems. So instead of reading something I created for you for this moment, I Frankensteined a collection of lines from 6 different poets: Aga Shahid Ali, Cecilia Wallach, Carolyn Bergvall, Maggie Nelson, Phil Hall, and Catherine Barnett. I'll put the actual information into the chat, and I'll read to you, starting with this. The birthplace of written language is bombed to nothing. How neat, dear America, is this game for you? The angel of history wears all expressions at once. What will you do? Look, his wings are aflame for you. The 92-year-old Rom we met this evening, who escaped from camps 9 different times and lived to tell, who's listening now? And how will we tell all these stories, we ask, and still tell stories ourselves? How will we connect the past to the future? How will we get lost? How does the present stay all around us now indecipherable? Words are vibrations, acts of unity, prefigured that steep us into prefab, color, a reminder that beings and objects are vibrations in the end, but vibration, depth of contrast, intense attraction, spread across our volumes, terrible conflictual resonance explodes in the outlines, yet language perception begins as a sensation of structured resonance. I don't know how the jacarandas will make me feel next year. I don't know if I will be alive to see them, or if I will be here to see them, or if I will ever be able to see them as blue, even as a type of blue. We cannot read the darkness. We cannot read it. It's a form of madness, albeit a common one that we try. I just don't feel like you're trying hard enough. One friend says to me. How can I tell her that not trying has become the whole point, the whole plan? When I can't sleep, when I'm sick, when no one else is home, when I'm lost in transit, I tinker. This is my word for what I do, a slow, unclever, tactile, cheap, harmless rearranging of odd bits of my nature and gatherings until they sing off key. I tinker at long sequences. I stay close to notebooks, mostly when no one is looking. I'm increasingly filled with hopelessness, but sometimes when I'm up to my elbows in a line's perplexities, confidence lands its flocks upon me, and I feel inside the poem, unafraid. Geworvenheit is a German term for being thrown into a game without knowing the rules. That pretty much explains it. If only I could speak to whoever's in charge, what would I ask for if I could ask? Send up a larger room, says one of my uncles in the stateroom scene. Peace in the world, yes. Clean air, water, less prejudice, more intimacy, fewer lies. Sometimes after sex, my mind wanders and the clock resets and I'm supposed to explain into someone's armpit why I'm laughing. Even I want to know. Already it looks like we'll have to go soon, you and I, but try to stay a while longer. Now, I would rewrite that ending myself. I would say that we should replace the word sex in that last section with the word poetry, which would be, sometimes after poetry, my mind wanders and the clock resets and I'm supposed to explain into someone's armpit why I'm laughing. Even I want to know. Already it looks like we will have to go soon, you and I, but try to stay a while longer. Back to you, Mark.
Joseph, you're up.
All right, thank you very much to all, especially Mark. I'm just going to quickly read a short sequence. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. Fire, tsunami, walls of flame. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. The earth will kill us. We killed the animals. Everybody knows. Laughed myself to death in a book of donuts. Laughed myself to death in a glass of spells. Just say missiles, just say war, just say money, lock your door. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. Property is death. We make more death. You're almost out of teal ink. Is revolution real? Over the river and through the skull, we wait for the days to burn. Democracy is resource wars. Democracy is buying. We killed the animals. Everybody knows. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. It will get unimaginably worse. The dream was everybody gets more stuff. Property is death. The dream is don't kill yourself. The world ends. Things happen fast. We don't talk about it. Today is Earth Day. We don't talk about it. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. Twilight, almost twilight. The new warning is fire in your face. Cascades of tipping points, systems collapse, sudden collapse. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. We want property, we want death. Over the river and through the skull, we wait for the days to burn. And you are you, and you are someone else. Thunderstorm opens, rain in the streets, everywhere, rain in the trees. We brought our drinks, we listened. We had 50 years to understand this crisis, and we still are doing nothing. Growth, the frenzied ruination of every ecosystem. Wet light and wind, the sky is fire, shed your skin.
Thank you. That was just amazing. That was more than I hoped for, and of course it raises like so many questions for me. But before I get to my questions, I want to, does anyone who isn't among the presenters, would you like to say something, add something? Someone is typing. Someone loves Joseph's poem. No one wants to.
We all love Joseph's poem, and
Okay.
I just thought that this was all every presenter I thought was fabulous, and you know, Todd's essay poem, which totally brought up the issue that Nance raised of the nut. Suggesting that without a clear delineation among genres, all is lost, which I find just like a totally absurd thing. And you might think I'm going to get to a question here, but I'm not. But I also wanted to say that you know, we've had several panels that have approached these sort of these same issues. There were two great panels on poetry and ecology. One was, I think it was called The Poetics of Climate Change, and the other one I think was Poetry and Ecology, or something like that. And I mean, both of them went sort of very deep into this idea of how does poetry actually affect change, or what is the role of the poet in the political egregious dystopia that we live in, you know? And I think that, you know, this is like, I think this is a current that's running through the culture now, because I mean, this panel could almost be considered a continuation of those. The concerns are so congruous. But anyway, so that's I think that's the question we come to, you know, is what do we actually do, and what's possible, and what's not. You know, what is the role of the poet in this? That's my question.
I think that thinking about that, Bill, is that, you know, it's interesting to end with Joseph's poem and to think about the urgency of his question. You know, we had 50 years, or not his question, but the statement, we had 50 years, we had 50 years. And then to think about the questions that, when Taja says, how do we live with others? But then he sort of frames that inside, like it's almost a fantasy, right? Can we, is that even possible? And, you know, when Lisa wrote, who's listening now, right? And then Nance raising the, you know, this sort of phony, almost phony, don't worry, the thing that we say that you know, and the inaugural poems are so interesting to me because in a lot of ways, what they are is they're public statements, but they're public statements that, because they're inaugural poems, they lack a kind of, they lack a kind of like action, like there's no action attached to them. And then I think, well, what action can be attached, right? Like one of the things that I raised, I suggested to the other panelists that I was going to raise is, you know, I mean, where being a resident of Southern Mexico, if I raise my voice too high, I can be kicked out, right? I can be politically thrown out. Like if I were to criticize the current government, they could just say, okay, leave. And they could throw me out and that's that, right? And so, and that the same is true in the United States. If someone is a legal resident of the United States and criticizes the US government, they too can be kicked out. So there's a kind of, you know, there's a kind of necessary, or is there, silencing that goes into the choice. Like when we begin to make a series of choices, so of choices, we begin to silence ourselves, or we begin to get faced with the option of silencing ourselves, or we begin to get faced with refining ourselves. So what I'm bringing out is this, like, you know, we had 50 years to understand the crisis. Well, yeah, but we understood it from day one. So what is it that poetry is really doing? I mean, that's for, I don't mean that, I'm meaning that I don't have an answer to that. I have a question of it. Like, you know, I've been writing political poetry all my life, I think, but I don't know, you know, that it's, I don't know what single piece of legislation it's introduced or what changed, you know, and I think we don't live in a time where we poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, as Shelley put it. I think we live in a time where we're on such margins in a certain way that we get trotted out at inaugurations. We get trotted out. I don't know. I'm raising these as questions I have, not as though I have answers. So Todd, you're nodding. You're. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, no. Well, I don't think we're the legislators in any way,
Yeah.
shape, or form. You know, and I don't know. I think about I don't know, Jacques Rancière on critical art, or even Butler on subversive iterations, or Badiou on the event, whatever. I mean, it's all like all this stuff about the revolutionary ultimately comes down to whatever revolutionary activists or artists can instigate. You can't know in advance, right? I think it's all a leap of faith. So I think you just have to try not knowing
Sure.
what you'll do or to what extent you'll do it. So I don't think we can answer the question in advance,
Right.
really, but only retroactively. Yeah, I don't know. So what we can do
if we knew it wouldn't be revolutionary, I suppose.
I guess, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, but I feel like so many people want to know in advance, right? Like, what do I commit to, and is it going to do exactly what I want it to do? And I feel like that's naive, I guess. Unfortunately, I wish life were that easy.
Well, if we knew ahead of time, it wouldn't be poetry, then it would be dogma.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's what some people critique some political poetry for being, or the people who want poetry, right? This poetry, like maybe the guy who was railing against the inaugural poem felt like, oh, it was just a speech or a polemic, not a quote unquote poem. But I think poems, and I think all literature can entail quote poetic language, as well as other kinds of language, all kinds of different language, and cross those genre boundaries. So a poem doesn't have to only have quote poetic language, right? Just as a novel can have much poetic language and still be a quote work of fiction, you know. And they all have different tones and tints and value, I think.
A novel should have, I'd add.
Yeah, certainly my favorite novels, being a poet, are the most poetic novel, you know. Give me Wolf, you know.
Yeah.
Todd, I saw your poem as a piece of unacknowledged legislation.
Awesome. Hopefully it will pass Congress.
Yeah.
Just don't know
Well,
about
I
the
mean,
Senate.
I'm
I'm not sure about the
House, but it won't
Senate,
get through
but
the Senate.
I think my rep Nancy will back me.
Yeah. You know, I mean, one thing is that I think the guy's question about, you know, if we lose the delineations between genres, then all is lost. I think it's an interesting polemic. I mean, it sounds sort of facile and inconsequential, really. But I mean, if you consider the genre is not limited to poetry, novel. I mean, it's like genre, like Bakhtin, you know, treated genre as something that permeated the language. There is the genre, for example, of political debate. There's the genre of advertising slogans. There's like, you know, genre kind of threads through the language and really determines what we say to a great extent, more than like, you know, a lexical meaning. So actually, I think like fucking with genre is one of the more revolutionary things that one can do. I mean, because that's the way that you get at ideology. That's the way that you get at the linguistic patterns that are the underpinning of neoliberal capitalist society, you know? And so, you know, in that regard, I think that Amanda Gorman's like, more than the content of her poem, I think it was the genre of it that was really important, you know, that it was this kind of, that it paid homage to hip hop, that it like, you know, it took rhyme scheme and it used rhyme in the way that hip hop uses it rather than in the way that Shelley used it, for example. And, you know, I don't know. This stuff just popped into my head, but that's, yeah, that's what I gotta
That
say
becomes
about it.
a question, an interesting question about how do we, like the public role of the poet, right, versus the actual work that they're doing, right? I mean, Amanda Gorman, she stands for two things, right? She's, as you know, we identify her as a 23-year-old African-American woman, you know, who does this fantastic thing. Is it her identity that we're talking about, or is it her poem that we're talking about? And if we're talking about her poem, do we make it stand for, you know, does it have to do more work than she does, or less?
Well, I mean, the genre, you know, as I said in the comments, the genre is talking about positively about the guy coming in. One day I'll be talking about the gal coming in, but right now it's the guy coming in. And so, you know, you're kind of stuck as a poet, you know, with that. But you know, I think that that's what stood up, and what Jeff said in the comments, and you know what Bill said, and even the folks on Facebook who gave her, you know, a backdoor compliment, that it was rhymey and hip hoppy, and you know, it was spoken wordy, and you know, that made a list of all the things I loved about it. Just, you know, is that it was the genre that she was fucking with the genre. She's making it, you know, she's moving it a little bit, and you know, because the genre kind of blows anyway, I think that, you know, that she needs to, you know, that it does need some mixing up, you know, that, you know, here we go, another white guy in the office. So, you know, mix it up, mess with it, fuck with it.
I realize I'm not.
Yeah, I like Bronwyn's comment in the chat. Genre there's so clearly tied to rhetorical situation. I think that's totally. Do you want to expound upon that, Bronwyn? Or
Sure. I'll just say, I think, I mean, along with her poem, there's something about the way she performed it and her embodiment in that moment that to me was very important. And so sort of the use of gesture and sort of her presence and embodiment in that particular poem. And I think there are real limits to like, what are you going to do in that moment? And if you know, if you bring a poem that's maybe best on the page, or that's maybe best, you know, if you have to read it 3 times to really get into it, that seems in some ways like not recognizing that rhetorical situation and like what attention is available there, you know. So it felt like it was a reading of what is the situation and what will people actually respond to. And I think there is always, you know, a little bit that's sort of cringy in those moments where someone is like really positive and you're sort of like, oh, like, you know, this moment also has cynicism, but it's also like, is that also the situation and the sort of the role, right?
Well,
I think that's,
she didn't lie, which puts her above Frost. Because Frost's poem is nothing but lies. I've always really hated that poem. And I don't hate that
Terrible.
many poems, but in terms of rhyme though, something I did in the 80s, you can actually rap Shelley. Bill, you can try The Cloud. I'm serious. Try The Cloud. Do The Cloud as though it were the last poets doing it, which is what I did in the 80s. And it really,
I want to hear you do that, Joseph. Can you do that right now?
I was in my 20s. I'm not going to do it right now. But it works really beautifully. There's also a beautiful comic film, short film of a young British rapper, MC, poet, rapping Wordsworth, wandering lonely as a cloud. The romantic meters and rhyme schemes and stuff are really actually super relevant in a weird way, as obviously with ballads, but that's for another panel.
And it's clouds.
Yeah, I
It's
think
all about clouds.
I think iambic pentameter rap's great. Okay.
Yeah.
But the transgression of hip hop is that it will take iambic pentameter, it'll stretch the line
Yes.
to like,
and drill down into
20
it.
beats. Yeah.
Yes.
It'll it'll slow the line down. It'll rhyme at the same moment. Okay, but it'll slow the line down, and in the next one you'll get 20 words in the space of 5.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it's like,
But Shelley was doing a lot of that, actually. I mean, that's one of the weirdest things.
Yeah.
Shelley's meters are so like they're
bizarre.
really stretchy.
Yeah.
They really expand and contract in these odd ways.
Well, it might have been a bad example.
But that's why.
I'm not trying to pick on you.
Shelley wanted us.
Shelley's really interesting.
Us to legislate. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, getting away from meter for a second, I think one of the things people love about the Gorman poem is that it does bring hip hop to quote poetry, and so many Americans have no fucking clue what poetry is. I know none of my students do. Even junior and seniors coming into my poetry writing class I can't even name poets half the time. And so they see that, and it is a lot like hip hop, which they do know and they do love and they do recognize. And so I think that's part of why people love it. But hip hop is like it's the dominant genre of music and hugely successful and makes tons of money. Whereas the, I guess, more challenging, less accessible, Bronwyn brought up the necessity of accessibility to performance poetry, right? You've got one shot, that's it, and you're only hearing it, you can't even see it, you can't go up and read. So it has to be, right? You have to be able to consume it all in one hearing. And so that's a constraint that poets have to work over and against. But if you're doing quote page poetry and you want, I think the most, I don't know that anything other, I don't know, maybe only the most experimental quote unquote poetry is maybe all quote poetic language. And that's the least read poetry, right? Because it is the least accessible. Other poetries bring in polemic and narrative and so on and so forth to make things more quote readable, more accessible. But I think the corruption I was thinking of when I was spewing my little presentation on the page the other day was that corruption of the poetic, a la Kristeva, of the semiotic, of what disrupts sense and meaning and narrative as being what poetry perhaps has to offer, that can disrupt the system of commodification and so forth. And so I do want to preserve that. And I do want to value that. And I do want to say that it can be frustrating when all the poetry that gets the most attention is the poetry that has the least of that, I think. And that poetry then gets, known to most people as something very different from that. And that more people can't be, initiated into a more difficult poetic too. that they all just think, oh, I don't understand it immediately, so I can't do it. I can't do poetry, right? So many our students say that, right? Oh, I don't get poetry. And it's like, well, you're not supposed to get it in that particular way. And that is in fact the point of poetry, right?
Right, it's like when someone says, I don't get long division, like,
Yeah.
I mean, we all get long division, but
I get it. It just makes me break out in hives.
Yeah, so it's because, but I always, before I left the teaching field, because I love math and science, my poetry students would always say, oh, I hate math and science. And I would just say, well, it's because you were taught it badly. It's because no one showed you why it was beautiful or interesting. They just taught you because it was easier to grade. It's like the way we were taught poetry as haiku being 575, right? And that's it. Like, and if you can do 575, or if you can write, a sonnet, nobody grades nobody teaches in high school, at least that I wasn't taught it, that a sonnet's an argument, right? And if it was taught like that, instead of as this form that you have to master, oh, it's an argument. You mean that's all I have to do? Yeah, you know how to argue. Every 16-year-old in the world knows how to argue. I just think that partly, where poetry is taught out of us. I know we're low on time. Is that right? Is that because
we're actually fine.
We're fine, because something I wanted to, when I was this morning, when I was like writing my notes for this, and I was thinking about what to say or whatever, and one thing that came up was that I looked over the side, because I had this sort of like slightly feverish thing because of the vaccine. I looked over the side of my bed, and I never look at the books that are on the lower shelf, because those are the books that I don't. I mean, when Catherine and I moved down here, we brought about 10,000 books, and that's like the one shelf that I never look at, which is usually a good thing, because they're the books that I'm sorry I brought. But I saw this book by Tony Hoagland called 20 Poems That Could Save America. Does anybody know this book? Like, it's a very strange book, and it's a collection of essays. And I don't really think a lot or too much about all the poems that he says could save America. But like, I pulled this out, I was like, 20 poems that could save America? Who needs this panel if we could just have these 20 poems? And, but he comes up with these, he says, he's making a suggestion about what would make poems that could save America. And he calls it that mysterious inner space, the American mind. I remember when this book came out, and I think it was at like, it was at the MLA or something, not the MLA, what's the other one? The AWP. And Tony and I were talking, and he said, oh, you really need to own this book. I was like, are you selling me a book? And he's like, yeah, but he says, these are the criteria. Poetry teaches the ethical nature of choice. I think that's ethical nature of choice. Poetry respects solitude and self-discovery. Poetry stimulates daring. Poetry rehabilitates language, which I think, Bill, is what you were leaning into a little bit, though you wanted it to be transgressive. Poetry diffuses sexual anxiety and encourages curiosity, which sounds a little bit like something Frank O'Hara would say. Poems acknowledge trouble ahead. Poems rehearse the future. Poems teach aesthetics that are of broad application. It sounds awful. And I'm not going to read you the poems, but it occurs to me that anytime, I sort of like what he has to say, and I hate what he has to say, because it's reducing it to a kind of prescription that I feel like, any of us could easily say, no, that's not true. And we'd be just as right as he is. And that's, for me, one of the problems of if you're going to be on the cutting edge of something and not know what's coming, then you can't have a recipe for it. You can't have a prescription. You can't have, there's no vaccination against those who would hate poetry. I'm not going there with that. It won't work. But does that, like, anytime, you know, so 20 poems that could save America sounds like something one would want. And yet, to me, it's the exact opposite of anything I would want out of maybe that's the reason why this book was on the bottom shelf, because I didn't want to read it. Does any responses to that idea?
Does make me want to write a long series of poetry is responses that are poetry is the aggro, which seems to be partly his argument there, but
It's an argument, but is it a worthwhile argument? I don't know. This is what I when I talked in my opening part where I was talking about the expatriation of the poet. It was in a certain way, it's about becoming open to so many things that one can't contain, right?
do you think that's partly with being an American expatriate, or do you think that happens to all expatriates?
That's a really great question.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot. It's just, I lived for a long time in France, and there was this very strong sense of like American expats in France or Paris. And I know similarly in like Moscow, there's American expats, but there aren't associations for, well, I don't know of that many associations for like Czechs in America. There probably are, God knows, but it seems like a very specific mentality, and it kind of interests me sometimes.
But it's really interesting because one of the things I've been doing a lot is studying modern and contemporary Mexican poetry, and there's this really fascinating anthology. It's very small, but called Poesía en Movimiento, Poetry in Movement. And it has this long essay that starts by Octavio Paz. And Paz is so brilliant on Mexicanness, right? And he's, you know, if you've read Labyrinth of Solitude, if you've read any of his writings on Mexicanness, he's incredible. But he does this very funny thing in this introduction, which is, as he's writing about Mexicanness, of the Mexicanness of Mexican poetry and what makes it specifically Mexican, he's making an argument for international poetry, like that there is an international poetry, it's global, it cuts across all lines, that it doesn't make a difference where it's written, it's just poetry, right? And it's almost as though, I'm reading it and I was talking with a friend of mine here, Efrain Velasco Sosa, is a marvelous Mexican poet. I said, it sounds like Paz has like taken on like the colonized mind and made it. So I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that question, but it feels like the expatriate experience is when you give up what you know for something else. I don't know. I don't think there's a singular dynamic. Okay, I'm gonna back up.
I was trying to figure out if there's a difference between being an immigrant and being an expatriate mentally. I mean, is it just paperwork? Is it movement by choice? Because a lot of immigrants did arrive in, say, the US, not strictly by choice, sort of by choice, but often by choice, very consciously, you know.
Right.
I don't really consider myself an expatriate, but I am living in the US strictly by choice.
Right, there's an essay by Edith Wharton of all people.
Well, she was an American expat, you know.
Right, she talks about the difference between the immigrant, the refugee, and the expat.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and she notes that there's like little overlaps in those things.
Well, that's really a class division with Wharton, and I'm curious, I guess, if that's still something we're using as a conceptual, you know, it would kind of fit into the whole tidy liberal specificity of capitalism that expatriation is a very.
It's very class in her. Yeah.
Sorry,
'cause-
somebody-
It's,
Nancy.
it's a great book called Altogether Elsewhere, which has essays on expatriatism from James Baldwin, Edith Wharton, Mary McCarthy. People all, I mean, it's I love it.
I totally
Yeah.
want to move altogether elsewhere. I actually, back in the dark ages, like 20 years ago, I had a blog called Elsewhere.
It's a good book. I taught American expatriate literature in Prague and in Madrid and wherever we were in Europe.
Because I only saw part of that chat and I wasn't sure what you were referring. Okay. Neat. Okay, super interesting.
Catherine and I have talked about how there's part of the expat community here. We call it they're people of the movable feast. Like they're not really here, you know. They're here, but they could be anywhere because they don't learn the language. They're just, well, it's, you know, we like the weather and it's, you know, and it's reasonable to live here and people are nice and it's like, oh, it's a movable feast for you. And when it stops being nice, you'll move on, you know. But then there's
my neighbors calls my neighbor on the other side, who my old school neighbor says, oh yeah, he lives in New York, as in he's a New Yorker who kind of mentally hasn't, you know, he's lived here for like 15 years, but my other neighbor is still like, yeah, he doesn't really live here. So maybe he's a movable feast expat within his own.
Yeah. So, Catherine, did you want to say something? Because you're part of this little expat world. Not the movable feast one, the other one.
She's typing it in, but we'd love to see her.
You can't see her?
There
she
we
is.
go. There you are.
Nancy, you couldn't see me?
Hold on, Catherine.
You don't have gallery view.
Oh,
Yeah, I can see her. I can see her the whole time.
I have been seeing you the whole time. Hey, Lauren.
Hey! What the hell?
It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see you, Catherine. I see you.
Hi. Oh, someone wrote, Bronwyn, was that you? I want to be permeable, but I feel limited. I feel like moving here, I've become much more permeable. What else am I going to do?
It's true. I mean, you have to, if you want to be of the place and live in it and know it, and I don't know, but it's still, I mean, it's the opening, for me, it's been that what it's done to me as a poet is it's, you know, in one sense, it's wrecked me. And in another sense, I don't know if I've written anything better in this time.
Sometimes I think the act of moving out of wherever you initially were, whatever age that is, etc., forces you to analyze it in a way that you cannot analyze it from within. I'm not necessarily saying that it's a better vantage point, but it's certainly very different as a vantage point. And not having, I think I share with Nancy the fact that I grew up kind of all over the place, though I identify myself as being from Montreal. I don't really have a strong homing beacon. So I'm kind of envious of the people who never left wherever their home is, but I'll never understand that. So it's a very different position to analyze sort of corruption and hope and identity from, and it's interesting.
I've been thinking about what the opposite of corruption would be. That was sort of the problem for me in regard to thinking my way into this subject, like what, I mean, because corruption is anyway, the point is that just now it occurred to me that maybe the opposite of corruption is openness. Maybe what corruption is the compulsive need to impose a sort of closed view on things rather than trying to accept and enter their flux. I mean, so corruption in that sense could be cronyism, like well, let's just, give the money to those we're familiar with who don't challenge our worldview or something like that. But yeah, cruel optimism. Yeah. But maybe that's one way of thinking about corruption that's not entirely separate from economics, which is really important, I think, not to separate it. Like the metaphors for corruption, all sort of that I could think of earlier, all sort of Nietzschean vitalist organic metaphors. Like the opposite of corruption is dying, the opposite of corruption is decaying, the opposite of corruption is rotting, that sort of thing. And I agree with Todd that that's not really getting us anywhere. So maybe the opposite of corruption is I didn't mean just now that the opposite of corruption was dying. I meant that we see corruption as dying. So the opposite of corruption would be life or vitality. But maybe that life and vitality is more like a kind of openness and willingness to be in a state of remain in a state of uncertainty.
That's why it's so fascinating that so much of what people had to say was about urgency and uncertainty, right? That it wasn't like, like I sat here taking notes and all I could write down was the fact that people were asking questions, right? I mean, it was just really fascinating to me that like, how do we answer the question of corruption and hope with questions about corruption and hope? We don't seem to have. It's not that we don't have answers, but that our answers are just questions.
I do want to say something about this notion of corruption, which at first glance in the topic, I have to admit, kind of put me off, because to me, corruption in this sense is a term that is a ethical / legal term that goes with a neoliberal sort of police state mentality. I mean, it's a rooting out of corruption means a rooting out of white collar crime, and that's you hear the word used most really by sort of law enforcement, and people like that. And I think there's this, that in a very real way in the culture, I mean, if you just say the word on the street now, not among poets, I think that's its real meaning, is this kind of, it's an ethical term that's tied into the ethic of capitalism. And yeah.
There's also
I'm not sure that I'm anti-corruption. I'm not sure that I am. I think I'm probably corrupt and proud of it. Yeah.
It does seem to mean something anti-capitalist in Russia right now. Like the whole Navalny movement seems to be about opposing Putin's corruption, and it seems to be a way of talking about ethics and economics sort of at the same time. I'm just trying to look for the best. It seems like it's really galvanizing in a lot of movements, populist movements around the world that don't declare themselves as nationalist or nativist, but that are thinking about economics more. So in that sense, it's opposing corruption is a little bit like a kind of Puritanism. Sure, absolutely. Like, let's go back to fundamentals, etc. I meant 17th century Puritanism, not like current evangelical crap.
Yeah.
There's also a thing of I'm doing a lot of work right now in, like, I'm reading a lot of old texts, like the Psalms, and reading the history of the Psalms is fascinating because scholars talk all the time about corrupted texts. And it doesn't mean that they're not great texts. In fact, some of them are beautiful. But there's a kind of, what does it mean that a text is corrupted? It means that it, and it doesn't mean, it grows to mean, and this is where the Puritanism thing comes in, it can grow to mean, well, it's not true. But that's not what that's not what it has to mean. A corrupted text can be just one that's a variation on the one that people have been carrying around in their notebooks. And now there's a new version of it, and that one might feed us even more. And so it's a really interesting, it's a problem word. That's kind of why when we changed the year of this workshop or whatever roundtable, I wanted to include the word hope, not as an opposite, not as saying there's corruption and there's hope, but because it's corruption and hope. It was to say, what are the ways that that we can hope in the world with all the possibilities of corruption? That's a little weird, but it's accurate.
I'm gonna have to go walk this dog. There, I said it.
Nance, it's so good to see you.
It's
Yeah,
really
you
good to
won't
see
say
y'all
that.
again. Thanks so much.
It's so good to see
This
you.
is really
So good to see so
fabulous,
many
y'all.
fabulous faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Bye, Ned.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Nancy.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
All
bye.
right. See you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark, for organizing it. I'm so glad you and Todd feel better also.
Me too.
Oh, I know. Friday night
I'm
was just
sure-
hell. It was awful.
Oh yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
alternating chills and sweats. It was
Oh,
just like,
no.
I'd
Yeah,
move
just
the
feeling-
cover
Yeah.
a tiny bit and I'd go from too cold to like burning up or freeze. It was, I don't think I slept till like 6 a.m. It was
Mm.
awful.
But now
Yeah.
you're
But now I
You're
feel
okay.
fine.
Great.
actually, so.
Well, it's all the coffee.
Yeah.
coffee. Coffee is also magic. There is
The
that.
opposite of corruption is coffee.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. It's
Fine.
fine.
Yeah, but wine's a corruptive force because the grapes are corrupted. But I mean, that's why I read the corrupted texts of other people's work was to
Yeah.
corrupt.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I want to just, well, they're not in there. Yes, they are corrupted texts. That's
Well, and in the sense that every translation is a mistranslation and every text is a collage. I mean, all the texts that we're going to ever know are corrupted texts.
Nice. Yes.
Yeah. Including the way
And perhaps there are
immediately
no
when we
corrupted
write it is
texts.
corrupted, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is no uncorrupted
Loss.
text.
Yeah.
Ross Glacier.
Yes.
It's been like
how
5
are you?
lifetimes since I've seen you. How are you?
I know. Well, I see you on a couple of the chats before, but yeah, but great. Wow, you really, that was really nice. I really liked your talk today, or your poem. I call it a poem. By the way,
Yeah,
the
thank you.
advantage of
Totally.
getting your vaccines now is you can go to Europe now. They just announced it.
Yeah.
They're accepting vaccinated people again. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can come to
But
Mexico.
yeah, nice to see you. Huh?
Yes.
You can come to Mexico if you've got your vaccine. You can come without.
Oh, really?
Oh, sure.
Sure.
Sure. We welcome you.
See, I want to drive.
We need your dollars. We're broke.
Yeah.
That's also Europe's reason for accepting Americans, actually.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
Yeah.
They're looking at summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're really screwed if they don't get American
There's
tourists.
corruption for you.
Well, then it's my duty.
It's your duty. You've got to
go-
go. You got to go
Yeah, it
somewhere
is,
now.
yeah.
It's your
Deep in
duty
that
to-
credit
say
card
your
debt
duty
and
to-
go to Europe this time.
Love y'all.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Gonna take
Bye.
off.
See you guys.
So much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Next
you.
year in person, we can actually have some of that wine.
Thanks.
Next year. Next year.
Next year in New Orleans.
We all have wine in New Orleans, and we
Yes.
continue to
That's
discuss
right.
how corruption.
Absolutely.
Sorry, after 5 o'clock, that's that. Okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what else is going on. All
Thank
right.
you.
Later, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.